Pacific of the North, of a land where the mountains are nameless and the rivers all run God knows where. But Canol is also a war story. In the spring of 1942, after the Japs had bombed Pearl Harbor and overrun the islands of the South Pacific, they became a serious threat to America in the north. From Alaska, the Aleutian Islands stretch out like stepping stones toward Japan. If Japan could scramble over these stepping stones from the east and gain a foothold on the mainland of Alaska, she might be able to cripple our shipping in the North Pacific and launch an aerial or amphibious attack against our west coast. Of course, Alaska was not defenseless, but its bases were inadequate to turn back a determined attack. And these bases could be supplied only by water or by air. There was no overland connection between the United States and Alaska. To overcome this gap in our vital defenses, the United States Army in March of 1942 started building the Alaska Highway. Beginning at railhead at Dawson Creek in British Columbia, this would give us an emergency land route 1,500 miles long to Fairbanks, in the heart of Alaska. But still more important, it would supply a chain of airports and flight strips along its route for the use of fighter planes, bombers, and transports. However, the building of the Alaska Highway posed another problem of supply. The trucks using the highway needed fuel. The planes using its airfields needed fuel. War has an insatiable appetite for fuel. And when the highway was begun, there was no certainty that the shipping lanes to Alaska could be kept open. Even if they could be kept open, the tankers required to fuel the highway were urgently needed elsewhere. But there was oil available in the north. More than 150 years ago, oil seepage had been noted in northwestern Canada, along the banks of the great Mackenzie River, only 75 miles from the Arctic Circle. Here at Norman Wells was the most northerly producing field on the North American continent. It had been developed on a small scale since 1920, but it could easily be expanded. And this oil had some important virtues. It had a paraffin base, and it had a low pour point, which meant that it would flow at temperatures down to 70 degrees below zero. Out of this combination of circumstances, then, the United States War Department evolved a plan. With the consent of the Canadian government, it would develop the Norman Wells field until it was capable of producing at least 3,000 barrels a day. At the same time, it would build a pipeline across the bush and rugged mountains 600 miles to Whitehorse, a Yukon town about halfway up the Alaska Highway. Here it would build a refinery to turn the Norman crude into gasoline for planes and trucks. That was the plan. It marked the beginning of the greatest construction job since the Panama Canal. In the extent of area covered, and from the standpoint of sheer pioneering, the pipeline, combined with the Alaska Highway, was destined to become the biggest construction program in the history of the world. It was named Canol, short for Canadian Oil. Canol began in the spring of 1942. By June, reconnaissance planes were plotting a route across the virtually unexplored mountains of the Mackenzie-Yukon Divide. Over this wilderness, a pipeline somehow must be built. But in order to build a pipeline, there must first be a road to provide access for construction and year-round maintenance. In fact, a pipeline is 90% road. At present, there wasn't so much as a trail. Back at headquarters in Edmonton, Alberta, the civilian contractors who had undertaken the job for the Army knew it would be tough. And they wanted to make sure that the men they hired knew what they were up against. Still, the men came. They came from Texas and Oklahoma, from California, from Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan. There were Canadians, too. There were welders, carpenters, cooks, iron workers, cat skinners, all determined to play their parts in this saga of the North. In June, construction material began rolling northward 285 miles from Edmonton to Waterways, the end of steel. From here, thousands of tons of equipment must be sent by water more than 1,100 miles to the job site. Army engineer battalions, both white and colored, established a camp at Waterways. Before long, they were transporting supplies downstream on ponton rafts. Later, prefabricated barges were brought in by rail. Through the summer of 1942, the barges were launched at the rate of 2 or 3 a day. Once launched, they were immediately loaded and sent on their way north. Canol, unlike any other construction job in history, first had to build its own transportation system, then transport not only its own equipment and machinery, but housing, foodstuffs, and all the trappings of civilization for its thousands of workers. "285 miles north of Waterways, navigation on the Slave River was interrupted by 16 miles of rapids. Here at Fort Fitzgerald, everything had to be unloaded and portaged. Even the barges had to be lifted out of the water and hauled over the old portage road, which had been improved and widened by the Army. The 16-mile journey took about 4 hours. At the foot of the rapids was Fort Smith, administrative center of the Mackenzie district of Canada's Northwest Territories. Here, the barges were launched and loaded again. Everything had to be transshipped, including more than 9,000 tons of pipe. The 4-inch pipe came in 22-foot lengths, each length weighing about 220 pounds. Colored engineer troops developed great skill in handling the pipe. Without neglecting other skills, of course. Leaving Fort Smith, the barges began the 850-mile trek north. On down the Slave River they went, then across Great Slave Lake, fifth largest body of water on this continent, and into the Mackenzie River itself, that little-known river which in North America is second only to the Mississippi in length and drainage. Working alongside the diesel tugs brought in by the Army were old wood-burning stern-wheelers. Every available boat or barge on the river was pressed into service. It was a strange armada which floated down the broad Mackenzie in the summer of '42, an armada foreshadowing change and growth. And the old trading posts on the banks became aware of a quickening pulse in the life of the North. The end of the run was Norman Wells, on the east bank of the Mackenzie. Some of the freight was unloaded here, the rest across the river at Canol Camp, which was just being built. Trip after trip was made by the tugs and barges during the summer. But the season was just too short. There were only 5 months of open water. Other means of transportation had to be used in the battle against time. For years, northern bush flying had been done by planes using floats in the summer. But these planes were small. They could carry only a few passengers and a little freight. In the winter, the same planes operated with skis. The lakes and rivers were still their landing fields. But in the fall, when the ice was forming, or in the spring when it was breaking up, the planes were grounded, usually for a month or 6 weeks. large transports were needed, and transports needed airports. Shallow-rooted subarctic jack pine, spruce, poplar, and birch were mowed down like grain. Before the winter of 1942 had set in, Army engineers and civilians hacked out of the wilderness 10 airfields between Edmonton and Norman Wells. The first Army transport plane landed at Norman Wells in October. Another transportation chain had been forged. At any season of the year, vitally needed men or supplies could be rushed to the job site in a matter of hours. But still, the transportation problem had not been solved. In February 1943, a 1,000-mile winter road was broken through from railhead at the town of Peace River down the valley of the Mackenzie to Norman Wells and Canol Camp. The building of this road was a feat of pioneering in itself. The northern half of the route was through virtually unexplored country. And even after the road was pioneered, moving supplies and equipment over it was still a tough job. Was carried by tractor trains. The train stopped to let the truck convoys pass. The Mackenzie Road was purely a temporary expedient. Camps were few and far between. Each truck convoy was on its own. Now the supply routes to Canol Camp were complete. With the water route, the air route, and the winter road, men or machinery could flow uninterruptedly to the place where they were needed. The Aleutian Islands had become a battle zone in the summer of 1942. The Japs had sneaked over to Attu and Agatu and Kiska. But at Kiska, they were pinned down by our bombers. In Aleutian waters, our air forces and Navy hammered the Japs until they were powerless to move closer. And Jap submarines had been driven from our Pacific shores. These circumstances favored stepping up the pace of the Canol project rather than slowing it down. Ships could now use the inside passage up the coast of British Columbia and Alaska without fear. Moreover, the White Pass and Yukon Railway from Skagway to Whitehorse had accumulated enough rolling stock to haul supplies for Canol as well as the Alaska Highway. So it was determined to hasten the construction of the pipeline by working from both ends. We had need to press our advantage. A staging camp was established at Prince Rupert on the British Columbia coast. supplies for Canol were moving up the inside passage on barges to Skagway. At Skagway, the barges were beached and unloaded, and the freight started on its 110-mile northward journey over the winding, narrow-gauge White Pass and Yukon Railway. This railway is one of the steepest in the world, rising nearly 3,000 feet in the first 23 miles. It was completed in 1900, following the trail used by thousands of adventurers seeking their fortunes in the Klondike during the gold rush of '98. To ensure its continued operation under emergency conditions, the Army took over. And all through one of the worst winters in history, soldier engineers and trainmen kept equipment and supplies rolling into Whitehorse. In November, the Alaska Highway was holed through as a pioneer road. At Dawson Creek, railhead at the southern end of the highway, Army engineers and the Canol constructors established a camp. By January 1943, pipe dollies were rolling northward toward Whitehorse. And this completed the first phase of the project, the construction of the all-essential supply lines, which made the building of the pipeline possible. First, there was the inland water route down the valley of the Mackenzie to Norman Wells and Canol Camp. Then the string of airfields and the winter road paralleling the water route. Next, the inside passage from Prince Rupert to Skagway and over the narrow gauge railroad to Whitehorse. And finally, the Alaska Highway. These far-flung arteries of supply encompassed an area of hundreds of thousands of square miles, an area strategically important in peace as well as war. The supply routes required the erection and maintenance of countless relay camps and bases, such as Mills Lake, Peace River, Watson Lake, Whitehorse, Skagway, Carcross, Johnson's Crossing, Canol Camp, Norman Wells. Now it was time to build the pipeline. As early as June 1942, the first exploratory flights had been made. Planes continued to fly the rugged divide country in search of a route. Later, surveyors with pack dogs climbed over the mountain slopes. Even horses were used on occasion. In the winter, local Indians were employed as guides. They led the surveyors across country never before trodden by white men. High in the Mackenzie Mountains, a trail for the road builders was blazed by a tractor train which had set out from Canol Camp in the early spring of 1943. only break in the crew's isolation was a single-motored, ski-equipped plane, obsolete but surprisingly safe in the hands of an expert Canadian bush pilot. The plane made trip after trip to deliver fuel and mail. There was great activity on the other side of the divide. By February 1943, engineer troops were pioneering the Canol Road from the west. Starting from the Alaska Highway at a point east of Whitehorse, they struck out toward Norman Wells. Shrugging off the cold, they drove their cats day after day against the virgin bush. To pioneer a practical route across this rugged terrain took the combined efforts of hundreds of men and countless pieces of machinery. It also took time. Actual construction of the road did not get underway until May 1943, when a lead crew set out from Canol Camp and headed for the mountains. It was destined not to turn back until it met a similar crew from the west about 7 months later. As the lead crew carved its way into the mountains, up canyons, over ridges, striving always to avoid swamps and glacial frost, its dozers hacked out a path for the road builders to follow. Moving a couple of miles on good days and only a few yards on others, they struggled on. Follow-up crews were moving dirt, shaping and widening the road, smoothing the surface, putting in culverts, and building bridges. And for all this work, supplies must constantly be brought up the line. Sometimes heavy rains washed down the slopes and flooded the canyon. Where bridges were lacking, trucks were towed across the swollen streams by tractors. Still, the work went on. And behind the road builders came the pipeliners. Laying their pipe and welding it. On the other side of the divide, the engineer troops, who were needed in battle zones, were replaced by civilian crews in August. Sheldon, halfway between Whitehorse and Norman Wells, the work was going very slowly. In this locality, there was permanent ground frost. If the insulating vegetation was disturbed, the ground beneath would quickly thaw and become a quagmire. Newcomers to the north learned the hard way, by experience. But they did learn. They learned that the only way to build road over glacial frost is not to break the cover, but to pile up rock and gravel and brush over it to keep the frost locked in. As the second summer turned to fall, the pipeliners continued in the wake of the road builders, laying and welding mile after mile. Slowly, the two ends of the line were moving toward each other. When the geese and the swans flew south, the men knew that the second winter was at hand. The ptarmigan's plumage had changed from summer brown to winter white. The barges and power boats lay snug on the banks of the Mackenzie. And the waters of the mighty river were still. The subarctic winter brought its own special problems of snow and cold. But time would not wait. Men and machines must keep working. To save time, the pipeliners often lunched on the job instead of going back to camp. And they thought of the sign in the employment offices, "This is no picnic." At Norman Wells, more and more derricks were rising against the sky. Geologists under Army direction discovered that the Norman Wells area was a major oil field, a field capable of producing far more than the original quota of 3,000 barrels a day. The one tapped pool alone was estimated to contain a reserve of 50 to 100 million barrels. From it, at least 20,000 barrels a day could be taken. And to store this oil, there had to be tanks, great concentrations of them. One large tank farm was built at Norman Wells, another at Canol Camp, another at Whitehorse. And as supplementary pipelines were run to the sea and up and down the Alaska Highway, additional tank farms were built at Fairbanks, Carcross, Watson Lake, and Skagway. While these tank farms were being built, the refinery at Whitehorse was also getting underway. Begun in June of '43, the refinery was well advanced by October. Through the fall and winter, the refinery rapidly took shape. And always the pipeliners kept plugging along behind the road builders. The pipe was laid on the surface of the ground, which simplified construction and maintenance. There was no need to bury it, because the Norman crude would flow at even the coldest temperatures. allow for expansion and contraction, the line was bent and curved to follow the contours of the terrain. The pipe crews worked in relays, each crew laying and welding a given number of miles. Cold weather never interfered. Welds were made, and they held, at 40 and 50 degrees below zero. Following the welders came the testing crews. They blocked off a section of line, filled it with compressed air, then coated each weld with kerosene. If bubbles appeared, there was a leak, and the foreman welder was called over to fix it. For living quarters, truck drivers and construction crews on the west side used semi-permanent camps, igloos and frame buildings supplemented by tents. Construction crews on the east side lived and traveled in self-contained caboose trains. Cabooses had been hauled over the Mackenzie Winter Road on sleighs all the way from Peace River. As each crew finished a section of line, it would break camp and leapfrog the crews ahead until it reached its next assignment. Meanwhile, the road builders were rapidly nearing a junction. By December 30th, 1943, a gap of only 7.5 miles remained. This gap extended across barren, windswept McMillan Plateau, where the undrifted snow was 4 feet deep. A road locator on snowshoes trudged across the lonely gap and blazed a trail by tying bits of red cloth to stunted bushes of willow and birch. That evening, from the advance camp on the eastern slope of the divide, 2 tractors with dozers set forth to hole through the Canol Road. Long in the bitter cold they worked, bucking drifts, straying off the trail, but gradually pulling their way forward. Early in the morning of December 31st, they broke through into the dead end of the road coming from Whitehorse. There was no one there, no welcoming committee, no one to offer them a hot cup of coffee. They simply broke through into an empty road and trundled off to the next camp to get some sleep. New Year's 1944 saw the problem of supply greatly simplified. Loaded trucks could now roll up the Alaska Highway and across the Canol Road right to Canol Camp on the Mackenzie. And pipe could be hauled from the stockpile at Canol Camp to any point on the road. As the road builders and pipeliners forged ahead, telephone crews were busy too. Logging crews cut thousands of ancient spruce trees. After dragging them out of the bush, they loosened the bark over a fire and peeled them clean. Up on treeless McMillan Plateau, a bulldozer fought through the drifts to carve out a right-of-way. The pole setters followed. Steam was often used to thaw out frost-blocked ground. Once the poles were up, the wire stringers went to work. Now a telephone line paralleled the pipeline. Permanent communication had been established. At the same time, pumping stations had to be built at intervals of about 40 miles along the entire length of the main pipeline and along the supplementary pipelines which were being constructed from Whitehorse to Skagway, Watson Lake, and Fairbanks. The welders and the cat skinners were handling the tools to complete the pipeline. But they simply represented thousands of men and women working at scores of different jobs from Edmonton to the far north. Storms were violent and prolonged. Traffic was often tied up for hours or even days. But no matter how deep the drifts, the road was always cleared. And the trucks rolled through. By mid-February, there was a gap of only a few hundred feet in the pipeline. The joints were already strung. Now they must be laid and welded. On the 16th of February, on McMillan Pass, the truck drivers and cat skinners began to gather shortly before noon. They were here to see their pipeline finished. The superintendent took over to make the golden weld. There was no ceremony, no sirens blowing, no champagne to break over the completed pipeline, not even a bottle of beer. This looked just like any other weld. But the men watching realized the significance of the occasion. They knew what lay behind it. The final weld was made just 20 months after the first reconnaissance plane flew over the Mackenzie-Yukon divide. Now, crude oil from Norman Wells flows across the divide to Whitehorse. At Whitehorse, the oil is digested by the refinery. And the refined products flow out to fuel the thousands of vehicles using the Alaska Highway. They are pumped to flight strips and airports stretching from Watson Lake to Fairbanks. And if necessary, they can be sent on down to Tidewater at Skagway. The United States and Canada dedicated the refinery at Whitehorse April 30th, 1944, in a joint ceremony. In peacetime, the 1,600 miles of pipelines, the roads, the refinery, and the tank farms, all of which are the Canol project, will be remembered chiefly as the means of developing new and important petroleum resources. and as the instrument which pried open a vast and fabulously rich hinterland for the joint benefit of the United States and Canada. During the war, Canol will play an increasingly important role in speeding supplies and planes and men wherever they may be bound in our great Northwest.